The 1,970 seconds were a transformative time for Native American children, filled with powerful experiences and cultural moments that shaped their world. But what stood out during that decade? Here are 25 memories that Indigenous people who grew up then will never forget. Watching the occupation of Alcatraz and Wounded Knee unfold was more than just news for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. It was a cultural awakening that brought entire communities together. The American Indian movement, with its bold activism and proud stance, hosted actions that celebrated Native resistance, sovereignty, and identity like nothing else in recent history. Kids would listen as their parents and elders discussed the latest developments, eager to understand what it meant for their people's future and to hear about warriors standing up for treaty rights. The movement featured leaders like Dennis Banks and Russell Means, showcasing the strength in Indigenous unity and determination. For many Native kids, these events were proof that their people were powerful, resilient, and worthy of respect. It was not just about protest. It was a weekly reminder that Native sovereignty deserved to be recognized and honored. Wearing ribbon shirts, jingle dresses, and embracing traditional regalia was a powerful statement of pride for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. During this time, many young people rejected the pressure to assimilate into white society and instead celebrated their Indigenous heritage. Traditional clothing became an iconic symbol of Native pride and identity, with kids and teens proudly wearing their regalia at powwows and cultural events. It was not just about fashion, it was about reclaiming their culture and showing the world that Native traditions were something to be proud of. Ribbon shirts with their colorful silk ribbons and meaningful designs became popular clothing choices for those who wanted to connect with their ancestry. Wearing these garments was a way to honor the ancestors while fighting for cultural survival. Parents and community leaders encouraged this movement, teaching kids that their traditions and identity were beautiful just as they were. Watching Native artists and musicians gain recognition was an unforgettable experience for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. Buffy Sainte-Marie burst onto the mainstream scene with powerful voice, meaningful songs, and activism that had everyone paying attention. Hits like Up Where We Belong played on radios, and kids would gather to watch her performances on television programs and folk music shows. She was not just a talented musician. She was Native, outspoken, and proof that Indigenous people could achieve mainstream success while staying true to their roots. For many children, seeing Buffy Sainte-Marie on television meant seeing themselves represented in a positive and powerful way. She showed that talent, activism, and cultural pride could break down barriers and capture the hearts of audiences everywhere. Her traditional clothing, unapologetic advocacy, and undeniable talent made her a role model for an entire generation. Seeing Native stories on television was rare but groundbreaking for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. Before this era, Indigenous people were almost never portrayed authentically on TV. When shows did feature Native characters or documentaries about reservation life appeared, it created important conversations. Kids related to seeing their realities acknowledged, even if imperfectly, as programs occasionally addressed life on reservations. Some shows tackled serious issues like poverty, discrimination, and the struggle to maintain traditions while still showing resilience and strength. For Native children watching at home, it was powerful to see stories that even remotely reflected their experiences. It made them feel less invisible. Representation mattered deeply, even when it was limited. Families would gather to watch together, discussing what was shown accurately and what was wrong, teaching children to think critically about how their people were portrayed. Listening to traditional drum groups and learning powwow songs was a defining part of life for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. The drum was more than just music. It was the heartbeat of the people, a connection to ancestors, and a celebration of Indigenous culture and spirituality. The powerful drum beats, melodic singing, and sacred nature of the songs made it impossible not to feel connected to something greater. Kids would dance at powwows, in community centers, and anywhere they could hear the drum circle gathering. Northern and Southern drum styles each brought unique sounds and traditions to gatherings. The songs carried stories, prayers, and history that had been passed down through generations. Intertribal songs brought different nations together in unity and celebration. For Native youth, drum music was a source of identity and spiritual connection. Visiting tribal community centers and longhouses was an essential part of life for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. These places were more than just buildings. They were cultural hubs where families gathered, ceremonies were held, and traditions were kept alive. Community centers buzzed with activity from language classes to beadwork sessions, basket weaving, and traditional storytelling. Kids would sit and listen as elders shared creation stories and taught important lessons, absorbing the wisdom and cultural knowledge being passed down. These gathering places were especially important for young people who learned about their heritage, gained confidence in their identity, and built connections with their community. The smell of cedar, the sound of drumming, and the warmth of familiar faces made these spaces feel sacred. Tribally run centers and traditional longhouses provided jobs, preserved culture, and gave people a sense of belonging and continuity with their ancestors. Watching the revival of traditional ceremonies and dances was an exciting and meaningful experience for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. After generations of forced suppression, Indigenous communities were reclaiming their spiritual practices and cultural traditions. Sun dances, potlatches, green corn ceremonies, and other sacred rituals were being practiced openly again. Seeing elders and cultural leaders stand strong in their traditions was powerful. For many Native kids, participating in or witnessing these ceremonies was transformative because it connected them to thousands of years of ancestral wisdom and spirituality. The federal government had tried to erase these practices through boarding schools and bans, but they survived. These ceremonies were not performances or historical reenactments. They were living traditions that commanded reverence and respect. However, the revival also sparked conversations within Native communities about how to protect sacred knowledge, while sharing enough to ensure cultural continuity for future generations. Watching Native athletes like Jim Thorpe's legacy honored and contemporary athletes excel was a source of immense pride for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. Though Thorpe had passed, the 1,970 seconds saw renewed recognition of his achievements and what he represented. His legacy as one of the greatest athletes of all time inspired countless young people to dream big. Beyond his memory, contemporary Native athletes in rodeo, basketball, and other sports were household names in their communities who showed what Indigenous excellence looked like. These athletes were more than their accomplishments and trophies. They represented resilience, determination, and the ability to succeed despite facing discrimination. Seeing these heroes succeed gave young people role models to look up to and proof that they too could achieve greatness in any field they chose. Participating in traditional harvest ceremonies and seasonal gatherings was a meaningful practice that connected Native kids to their heritage throughout the 1,970 seconds. These celebrations varied by tribe and region, from salmon ceremonies in the Pacific Northwest to wild rice harvests in the Great Lakes, corn dances in the Southwest, and first fruit ceremonies across many nations. For many Native families, these gatherings offered an opportunity to connect with the land, honor the gifts of nature, and teach children about gratitude and reciprocity. Kids participated in food preparation, prayers, songs, and dances that celebrated the relationship between people and the natural world. The gatherings often included traditional foods, medicines, and teachings about sustainable harvesting practices passed down through generations. For Native kids in the 1,970 seconds, these ceremonies were more than just events. They were a way to honor the old ways and build pride in being Indigenous. Learning about tribal sovereignty and treaty rights in school and community was an important experience for all Native kids in the 1,970 seconds, including Indigenous children who paid close attention. Discussions about the Indian Self-Determination Act, fishing rights battles in the Pacific Northwest, and land claims across the country taught about justice, persistence, and Indigenous law. For Native kids, these lessons were personal and urgent, helping them understand the ongoing struggle for their people's rights and autonomy. The knowledge empowered them, showing that treaties were not just historical documents, but living agreements that protected their future. What made these teachings special was that they came from elders, tribal leaders, and educators who had lived through these battles. Families would often discuss court cases and political developments together, and kids would carry what they learned with pride and responsibility. While the lessons were sometimes heavy with injustice, they were part of understanding what it meant to be Native in America and why fighting for sovereignty mattered. Listening to Native comedians and storytellers who used humor to address serious issues resonated deeply with Native families in the 1,970 seconds. Traditional storytelling had always included humor, and a new generation was using comedy to talk about identity, stereotypes, and the Native experience in America. Their sharp wit and cultural references tackled subjects that needed attention, making audiences laugh while also making them think critically about representation and racism. For Native kids who understood the context, hearing this comedy was like having their own experiences validated with honesty and intelligence. The storytelling ability and willingness to address difficult topics through humor set these performers apart. Parents would share jokes and stories at gatherings, and older children would remember the lessons embedded in the laughter. These voices had influence on Native culture and identity, showing that Indigenous perspectives deserve to be heard on their own terms. Hearing Native language speakers and participating in language revitalization efforts was crucial for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. Although many languages had been nearly destroyed by boarding schools and assimilation policies, communities were fighting to bring them back throughout the decade. Elders who still spoke fluently began teaching younger generations, and programs started forming to document and preserve Indigenous languages. Words and phrases in Dene, Lakota, Ojibwe, Cherokee, and hundreds of other languages were being passed down with renewed urgency. For kids, learning even basic words and phrases meant feeling connected to something their ancestors spoke for thousands of years. Language was not just about communication. It was about worldview, culture, and identity. Families would practice together, and communities would celebrate when young people learned traditional songs or prayers in their ancestral tongue. The language revitalization movement brought hope, purpose, and a sense of cultural survival that today's generation may not fully appreciate. Seeing handmade star quilts and traditional crafts honored in homes was a common sight in Native households during the 1,970 seconds. These beautiful quilts, with their intricate geometric patterns, were created with care and skill, often given as gifts for special occasions like namings, graduations, and giveaways. For many families, quilts and crafts represented cultural continuity and artistic excellence. Kids knew that these items were precious and meaningful, created by grandmothers, aunties, and skilled artisans in the community. The quilts were used during ceremonies, displayed with pride, and passed down through generations. Making and receiving them carried deep cultural significance beyond their physical beauty. The star quilts and beadwork became symbols of Native artistry and generosity, showing that the community valued tradition and honored one another through handmade gifts. For today's youth, the cultural protocols around quilts and giveaways might need explanation, but for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds, they were just part of life and ceremony. Going to powwows and intertribal gatherings was one of the most exciting activities for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. Powwows became important cultural events where Indigenous people from different tribes could come together, dance, sing, and celebrate their shared heritage. The sound of drums, the sight of dancers in regalia, and the smell of fry bread and Indian tacos created an atmosphere that was electric and sacred at once. Kids would watch fancy dancers spin, and traditional dancers move with dignity, hoping to one day dance themselves or already participating in youth categories. The grand entry was a big deal, and the moment when all the dancers entered the arena often brought tears and pride to families watching. Pow-wows were especially important because they provided spaces for Native youth to connect with their culture, make friends from other reservations, and feel part of something larger. The sense of community at these gatherings was profound, with families often traveling long distances to attend. For Native kids, in the 1,970 seconds, powwows were more than just events. They were affirmations of survival and cultural continuity. Having Wasaja and other Native newspapers in tribal offices and homes was important for Native communities in the 1,970 seconds. These publications were more than just newspapers. They were lifelines to Native news, activism, and achievement that mainstream media ignored. They featured articles about tribal politics, land rights struggles, cultural preservation, and profiles of Native leaders and artists. Families would read them carefully, learning about what was happening in Indian country beyond their own communities. For kids, reading these papers meant understanding that Native people across the continent were facing similar challenges and celebrating similar victories. The publications covered everything from sovereignty, battles, and treaty rights to cultural events and sports, offering a comprehensive view of Native life in America. Parents often saved important issues, creating records that documented the Red Power movement and cultural renaissance. These Native-run media sources were trusted voices that Indigenous families relied on to stay informed and connected. Attending Sunday services at Native churches or traditional ceremonies was a significant part of life for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. For some families, Christianity had been blended with traditional beliefs, creating unique Native Christian practices. Churches on reservations became community centers, where families gathered to worship in ways that honored both faiths. People wore their best clothes, and services often included hymns sung in Native languages. For other families, a return to traditional spiritual practices was happening, with ceremonies led by medicine people and elders. The spiritual gatherings were powerful, with prayers offered in ancestral ways that connected people to the Creator and the natural world. For children, participating in either or both spiritual traditions taught them values, respect for elders, and the importance of faith and community. These practices gave them grounding and identity in a world that often tried to erase Native ways. Benefiting from Indian Health Service programs and community health initiatives was part of reality for many Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. The Indian Health Service, despite its many problems and chronic underfunding, provided healthcare access in communities that otherwise would have had none. Kids would go to IHS clinics for checkups, vaccinations, and treatment when sick. Community health workers visited homes, and some programs focused on nutrition and wellness. While the quality of care was often inadequate compared to what non-Native Americans received, these services were vital for families on reservations and in Native communities. The programs represented the federal government's trust responsibility to provide health care as guaranteed by treaties. For many Native kids, the IHS clinic was their first introduction to the idea of health care as a treaty right, not charity. Community members also organized their own health initiatives, teaching traditional medicine and wellness practices alongside Western healthcare. Playing stick games and traditional Indigenous games in the community was a daily ritual for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. These games required skill, strategy, and often spiritual preparation, and they were sources of entertainment and cultural transmission. Stick games involved teams hiding marked sticks while singing traditional gambling songs, with opponents trying to guess their location. The songs, drumming, and camaraderie made these gatherings memorable and fun. Hand games and other traditional competitions were equally popular, with kids learning from elders and older youth. These games brought communities together, fostering friendships and teaching important cultural protocols. There was no need for expensive toys or modern entertainment. All they needed was each other, natural materials, and knowledge passed down through generations. For today's generation, the cultural depth and community bonds of these games might be hard to fully grasp, but for native kids in the 1,970 seconds, they were essential parts of childhood and cultural education. Knowing that discipline came from the whole community was a reality for native kids in the 1,970 seconds. In many indigenous communities, child rearing was a collective responsibility, not just the job of parents. Elders, aunties, uncles, and community members all played roles in teaching children right from wrong. Kids learned quickly that respect and proper behavior were expected by everyone, not just their immediate family. This community-based approach meant that any adult could correct a child's behavior, and kids understood they were accountable to their entire community. While discipline methods varied by family and tribe, for many native communities in the 1,970 seconds, this collective child rearing was traditional and accepted practice, a way to teach responsibility and ensure children learned cultural values. It was not about harshness, it was about connection and making sure children understood they belonged to something bigger than themselves. The community approach became a source of strength and identity that kids carried throughout their lives. For today's youth, this communal parenting might seem unusual, but for native kids growing up in the 1,970 seconds, it was simply how their people had always raised children. Watching Indian Education Act programs being implemented in schools was a transformative experience for native students and families beginning in the early 1,970 seconds. This groundbreaking legislation provided funding for programs specifically designed to meet the unique educational and cultural needs of Native American students. For years, Native kids had been pushed through school systems that ignored or demeaned their heritage. The Indian Education Act changed that by supporting Native language classes, cultural programs, and Indian education committees. Students began seeing their own histories taught, though often still imperfectly. The act sparked conversations in schools, tribal councils, and homes about what education should look like for Native children. For many Native kids, it was validating to see their parents and community members involved in school decisions. The impact was profound, even though implementation was inconsistent, shaping how a generation understood the importance of culturally relevant education. Wearing ribbon shirts to school, beaded earrings, and turquoise jewelry was essential expression for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. These items were everywhere from reservation schools to urban Indian centers, and they represented pride, identity, and connection to culture. Turquoise and silver jewelry carried spiritual significance and artistic heritage, with stones and designs that made a statement about being indigenous. For Native youth, wearing these items was a form of resistance against assimilation and a celebration of who they were. They paired traditional pieces with contemporary clothing, creating a style that was uniquely theirs. Parents often gifted jewelry for special occasions, and extended family members taught kids about the meaning behind different designs and stones. The fashion of Native kids in the 1,970 seconds was meaningful, unapologetic, and rooted in tradition. It reflected the cultural pride and determination of the era. For today's generation, understanding the significance of these choices requires knowing the context of cultural suppression that preceded it. But for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds, wearing their identity was an act of survival and pride. Shopping at trading posts and Native-owned stores in the community was a regular part of life for Native kids in the 1,970 seconds. These stores sold everything from groceries and supplies to traditional crafts, jewelry, and ceremonial items. For kids, the trading post was a place where they could see beautiful beadwork, pottery, and weavings created by local artisans. The store owners, often Native themselves, knew many families personally. greeting customers with respect and familiarity. These businesses were more than just convenient. They were vital parts of the community that supported native artists, kept money within tribal economies, and preserved traditional arts. Kids would accompany their parents, watching transactions and learning about the value of supporting native businesses. The trading post was a gathering spot where neighbors exchanged news, and children absorbed the importance of economic self-determination. For today's youth, the role of trading posts has evolved, but for native kids in the 1,970 seconds, they were essential community anchors. Understanding the American Indian movement's cultural impact beyond activism was something native kids in the 1,970 seconds experienced firsthand. AIM was not just about protests and occupations. It was a symbol of native pride, resistance, and self-determination. The movement's leaders spoke out against injustice, fought for treaty rights, and demanded recognition of native sovereignty. Kids admired their courage, their determination, and their willingness to stand up for Indigenous peoples, even when it meant arrest or violence. Watching AIM actions unfold was an event that brought families and communities together, with everyone discussing the news and feeling connected to something historic and important. The movement's messages and bold activism made native rights impossible to ignore. For native children, AIM represented the idea that they could be unapologetically Indigenous and fight for justice. It showed them that strength came in many forms, not just physical, but political, cultural, and spiritual as well. Making fry bread and traditional foods at family gatherings was a beloved tradition for native kids in the 1,970 seconds. During powwows, family reunions, and community celebrations, someone would set up to make fry bread, and the process would become a gathering point. Kids would watch the dough being stretched and dropped into hot oil, the smell drawing everyone closer. Sometimes they would help, learning the techniques passed down through generations. When the fry bread was ready, golden and puffy, everyone would gather to eat it with honey, powdered sugar, or as Indian tacos with beans and meat. Fry bread was complicated culturally. Born from commodity foods and hardship, but it had become a comfort food that brought families together. For today's generation, fry bread carries complex meanings about survival and adaptation, but for native kids in the 1,970 seconds, the smell and taste meant home, family, and community gathering. Smelling sage, sweetgrass, and cedar being burned for ceremonies was a sensory experience that native kids in the 1,970 seconds will never forget. These sacred medicines were used for smudging and purification, cleansing people, places, and ceremonial items. The smell of these plants burning filled homes, community centers, and ceremonial grounds, a scent that was both comforting and spiritually significant. Kids learned to participate respectfully in smudging, understanding that these were not just pleasant aromas, but sacred practices that connected them to the Creator and their ancestors. The process was taught by elders and spiritual leaders who explained the importance of each medicine and how to harvest and use them properly. While practices varied by tribe and region, the use of sacred plants was widespread across native communities. For native kids, in the 1,970 seconds, the smell of burning sage and sweetgrass was a reminder of ceremony, spirituality, and the sacred responsibilities that came with being Indigenous. Which of these moments from the 1,970 seconds hit closest to home for you? Drop a comment below with your favorite memory. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another trip down memory lane.